Good evening. Hi, my name is Sarah Blumenfeld, and I work for I'm the program director for the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation. In addition to hosting programs like tonight, the foundation, along with the Friends of the Lafayette Library, provides more than 60% of the operating budget for this library. It's only because of the Friends in the foundation that this beautiful library is open 7 days a week and has a professional library staff. In Contra Costa County, most libraries are closed 1 to 3 days a week. A couple program notes before we get started. On June 20th, our Science Cafe welcomes science writer Mary Roach. She'll discuss her latest book, Grunt, The Curious Science of Humans at War. On June 27th, we'll have a documentary film screening of a film called My Love Affair with the Brain, The Life and Science of Dr. Marion Diamond. The Lafayette Library hosts more than 1,000 programs each year for all ages. If you are not already receiving our AdLib weekly program newsletter, I encourage you to sign up in the lobby before you leave. It's the best way to find out about what's coming up at the library. Also, I wanted to just make a quick note to silence your cell phones before we get started. Our guest speaker tonight is Jason Turbow. He's an author and a sports writer who's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Wired, among other publications. He's written about a variety of sports and teams, including soccer, the Warriors, the 49ers, and even General Patton's Olympic pentathlon in 1912. More recently, he's written 2 books about baseball. In his first book, The Baseball Codes, it was a 2010 bestseller. Tonight, Jason's here to talk about his new book, Dynastic, Bombastic, Fantastic, Reggie Rowley, Catfish, and Charlie Finn's Swingin' A's. Jason will be joined on stage tonight by Glenn Schwartz. Glenn Schwartz is a baseball beat writer for 17 years for the old San Francisco Examiner. He covered the A's 3 consecutive World Series wins in the 70s, Bill Martin's A's in the early 80s, and finally the Will Clark-led Giants. Next, he was a sports editor for the San Francisco Examiner for 13 years and sports editor of the San Francisco Chronicle for 8 years. Glenn now edits Major League Baseball's website, MLB.com. So please join me in welcoming Glenn Schwartz and our guest author, Jason Turbow.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. Thanks for coming.
It's good to see so many A's jerseys and jackets in the crowd.
I didn't pick out this color either. I just grabbed whatever was in the closet. And I want everybody to know I didn't grow this mustache just because I was going to talk about the Mustache Gang tonight. I've had it before. Finley paid everybody $300 to grow one on that team. So.
And Ken Holtzman's response when offered $300 to grow a mustache was, for $300 I will grow hair on my feet.
Well, in 1971, I unexpectedly was put on the A's beat my second year at the newspaper, and it began a wild ride over the next 5.5 years. I was with the team at home all the time for the San Francisco Examiner as the beat writer, and occasionally travel with them. And as the team got better and better over the years, and I was able to travel more and more. And Jason's book is absolutely wonderful, and I can say that not only because I'm sitting next to him, but because I made it through it in one night, which I rarely do. And it just captured that era perfectly, and the personalities that I was very familiar with and have continued to stay in touch with some of them over the years. And Jason, I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you is, there's been so much written about the A's, and of course the definitive books of that time were The Mustache Gang by Ron Bergman, who was the Oakland Tribune beat writer for 9 years, and Charlie O by the late great Herb Michelson. So what was your inspiration for writing this book when there have been other books subsequently as well?
Before I answer the question, I have to give you props and thanks. Glenn was one of my first interviews for the book. He really helped set the groundwork for what I was hoping for and expecting out of these interviews. And Glenn went on to, I don't know how much introduction we were given, but Glenn went on to a long career as a sports editor of the Chronicle. So you guys may not know you're familiar with his work, but you're clearly familiar with his work. The inspiration actually kicked in Cooperstown, New York, a lot of years ago, when I walked through Main Street, and you know Cooperstown well. If you guys have been to Cooperstown, you know that Main Street, it's a baseball economy. It's nothing but souvenir and memorabilia shops up and down Main Street. And walking through those shops, it's nothing but Yankees and Dodgers and Mets and Red Sox and Cubs. And I was hard-pressed to find that this A's team even existed, let alone defined its era. And I really believe it defined its era. It's the only three-time champion other than the New York Yankees in the history of baseball. And it was a story that needed to be both retold and told fresh. The books you referenced are fantastic. If you guys have a chance to read either The Mustache Gang or Charlie-O, they're expertly written, but they both end far too soon. The Mustache Gang covers the 72 season, and that's it. It came out in 73. Ron Bergman was as good a beat writer as you will ever find. But the one thing those two writers did not have and were not able to have is perspective. Looking back on this team 40 years later, it's clear how good it was. And as I dug in, thanks to interviews with the people who were there, it dawned on me that this would be a great story even if it was a last place team. Like the day-to-day drama was just so over the top and so overwhelming. But the fact that these A's were as great as they were merited further attention.
You've mentioned that you built this book clearly around the foundation of Finley, but you also cite the three pillars, which were three people, one per year: the Vita Blue incident in 1972, the holdout.
Right.
Mike Andrews in 1973, when Finley wanted to fire him in the middle of the World Series, and then the Catfish Hunter departure.
Yeah.
By Finley not honoring his contract. So why don't you explain what struck you most about that and why you decided to build a lot of your book around those three incidents?
Well, I mean, the championships speak for themselves, and there's good baseball drama inherent in each of those, and I go into some detail about those in the book. But what defined this team for me came off the field. And like you say, it was the foundation of Finley. And he colored everything. The guy was, as you know, an egomaniac. He was completely incapable of delegating responsibility.
Narcissist.
A narcissist. He wanted decisions and praise alike passed to the top of the food chain. He was his own general manager. He called all the shots for that team, and thus everything that happened with that team was colored by his actions. And it just so happened that of the 3 seasons they won championships, there was a major development each season off the field that really affected how that team performed on the field. The first of those incidents that you brought up was Vita Blue's holdout. In 1971, Vita Blue was as good a pitcher as baseball has ever seen. He led the American League in endless statistical categories. He won the Cy Young and the MVP awards, becoming the youngest player, he was 21 years old, to win either award, let alone both in the same season.
300 strikeouts.
300 strikeouts, like a sub-2 ERA, won 24 games. The crazy stat to me, the craziest stat, is that because he was so hot, visiting teams around the league would, not visiting teams, home teams around the league, would schedule promotions based on when Vita Blue would visit their cities. They would have Vita Blue Day at their own ballparks, and 1 out of every 12 tickets sold in the entire American League in 1971 was to see Vita Blue pitch. Vita was making $14,500, almost the rookie minimum. I mean, that wasn't Finley being cheap. That was Vita being brand new to baseball and not established yet. After that season, Vita wanted a taste, obviously. And the thing about Charlie Finley is, Billy North said this to me, all Finley ever wanted was to be right about everything all the time.
Yeah.
And
Affirmation.
He would draw a line in the sand that he felt was fair, and damned if he could be pushed across that line. So he ended up making Vita a contract offer for 1972 that was $50,000. It was a considerable raise, and it was fair. It would have been the highest salary ever at the time for a second-year player. But Vida knew the finances. He knew that with one Vida Blue-style gate at the Oakland Coliseum, he would more than recoup the difference between what he wanted and what Finley was offering. But the thing about Finley is he didn't care. He didn't care that he was crippling his own best chances on the field by sidelining his pitcher if his pitcher held out. He didn't care that he was crippling his own gate without Vida Blue there to draw fans. And he let Vida hold out. Vida enlisted an agent, which infuriated Finley. None of the A's had agents at that time. And for 6 weeks, baseball did not have not only its best pitcher, but its biggest drawing card by a wide margin. Eventually, Commissioner Bowie Kuhn stepped in. And were you in Boston at that time? Were you on the road with the A's?
No.
Bowie Kuhn stepped in, and the A's were in Boston. He flew in Vida. After significant meetings, he ordered Vida to accept an offer that Finley had previously made and subsequently rescinded. He ordered Finley to reanimate that proposal. Nobody was happy. They all signed the deal very grudgingly. And in 1972, Vida Blue won 6 games. He went 6-10 on the season and was never the same pitcher after that. He became a very good pitcher again for a number of years, but he never captured that magic he had in 71.
He became so bitter, too, that whole season. It was just not the same going in the clubhouse after a game where we used to see him, and he was animated while he was icing his arm, and very approachable. And that year, after almost every appearance, it was just, oh, do I have to do this? I don't want to do this. Like, he gave you that feeling he didn't want to be there.
Yeah, how long did that last?
That season, it changed in 73.
Was he back to being?
He was pretty much, I don't say he was ever what he was in 1971, either on the field or off in terms of performance or personality and, temperament, I would say. But he was much better. And of course, he had a really good year in 73 and 74. 72, he was terrible except in the postseason. He helped win the American League Championship Series.
He did, coming in with 4 innings of
Detroit.
shutout relief in Detroit in the deciding Game 5. That was actually one of the fights. It's a quick sidebar here. Blue Moon Odom went 5 innings in Detroit, gave up no runs, and in the middle of the 5th inning, started dry heaving in the dugout. It was probably nerves. Blue Moon himself admitted that he liked to go drink a beer in the clubhouse between innings for hydration.
We did too.
Yeah. And his teammates ended up thinking he was drunk. He insisted that was not the case, that he didn't even have time to get to the clubhouse for that one beer. And he just started dry heaving. He was a nervous guy. He was known for his nerves. And eventually had to be pulled out of the game after that 5th inning, despite the fact he was pitching spectacularly. Vida came in and pitched 4 shutout innings that effectively won the American League for the A's. And I had numerous players say that of any outing of the entire dynasty, those 4 innings were the ones that were most important, because without them, the A's would never have known what they could accomplish, and they might not have reached the World Series that year.
That's right.
So Vida rebounded to become a very good pitcher, but after that season, like you say, he was incredibly bitter. Baseball went from being a sport that he loved to being a business that he was part of. Give me my paycheck, let me throw the ball, and then I'm going to go home. Kind of became his mantra for the season. Any other details of that story worth?
No, that
Stretching out?
covers it. I think
All right.
get to 73, and they had some adversity that year. They didn't play very well. They had a World Series hangover. As Joe Rudy said, we spent so much time making public appearances and such, between the end of the World Series in 72 and spring training in 73.
Mm-hmm.
We got there and felt we could just turn it on, and they couldn't, and then Catfish broke his thumb that year. Finley had a heart attack and then became
right.
even more dictatorial, more of a pain in the ass after that.
Could he become more surly? Oh, yes, he could.
Yeah, he could. He proved that. And then we come to the World Series and talk about the Mike Andrews incident.
Yeah, Finley did have a heart attack, and he became. The thing about the A's is that everything ran through Finley's office. And when Finley was sidelined with his heart attack, everything slowed to a crawl. He had to approve line items up and down the budget, which dealt from on-the-field issues to travel. And people didn't really know what to make of it. That came to color how he approached the following the following scenario. The A's signed mid-season a second baseman named Mike Andrews. He had been released by the White Sox. Dick Williams loved him because he played for Williams in Boston in the late 60s. Williams pennant winner in Boston. And he was Williams' kind of guy. He was scrappy. He was hard-nosed. When the A's got him, he was toward the end of his career. He was dealing with some shoulder issues. He was no longer a competent fielder. The A's knew this when they signed him. And Williams urged Finley to sign him strictly as a right-handed pinch hitter. He wanted bench depth. And that's what Andrews did for the second half of the 1973 season with the A's. He was almost exclusively a pinch hitter. Somehow, beyond all expectation, he found himself in extra innings in Game 2 of the 1973 World Series, playing the field for the Oakland A's. Having done almost none of it through the season and not being very good at it even when he was practiced, he made a couple of very costly errors. The A's lost the game, and Finley wanted a scapegoat. They were in the Oakland Coliseum, and Finley tried to think about how he could replace Mike Andrews on his roster with a minor league second baseman named Manny Trio, who went on to a significant big league career later with teams other than the A's. The only way to do that, because postseason rosters are locked, was to disable Mike Andrews and replace him as an injury replacement. He sent down the team doctor into the clubhouse, who poked and prodded Andrews for about 10 minutes. And based on his notes, Finley drafted a memo saying, in my opinion, Mike Andrews is too injured to continue playing in the World Series. And the doctor signed it. Didn't get injured in that game, but was too injured. He spent an hour in Dick Williams' office haranguing Andrews into signing it. His motivation was, aren't you a team guy? Don't you want to do what's best for the team? Manny Trio can help the team in ways that you can't. And Andrews said, it's not right. It's not true. The team, meanwhile, the rest of the A's are on the bus. They're showered, they're packed, they're waiting to go to the airport on an airplane for New York, and they don't really know why the bus is not going anywhere.
And the writers were with the team on the charter, in the dark.
Yeah, what was that bus like?
Well, we were just getting reports that some people from the clubhouse were letting people know as the late stragglers to the airplane said something's going on with Mike and Finley's trying to force him off the roster. But we didn't know until we landed in New York and started piecing together. What John Lindblom was a columnist for San Jose Mercury. He was the only one from that writing group that didn't go on the plane that night.
Right.
So we were trying to piece it together when we got to New York.
Yeah, Lindblom broke the story because he stayed back home. Yeah. He heard it from Vida Blue because Vida Blue is always late to everything all the time, and he was late to the bus. Lindblom ran into him on the elevator. A's players, a few of them had seen Andrews in the training room getting poked and prodded. They kind of pieced it together, and they spent that airplane ride to New York, those 5 hours, getting angrier and angrier, with the realization that if Finley could fire Mike Andrews for making errors on the field, he could fire any of them. And whoever heard of firing a player in the middle of the World Series? So the next day was media day in New York, an off day, wherein the players work out on the field. They have sessions with the media to prepare for the next day's game. Dick Green taped Andrews' number 17 on everybody's sleeves in athletic tape. And the New York reporters, as well as the Bay Area reporters, I imagine, couldn't get enough. How much of a frenzy was it to get into that?
We were going from the hotel lobby where we didn't want the players to go to the park so we could talk to them all before they left, then at Shea Stadium for the workout, and then back, there were more press conferences back at the Americana Hotel. Mm-hmm. And this went on through the night and into the next day before Game 3.
How would you describe the mood of the players during those sessions?
As pissed as they've ever been. It was, the anger obviously had some time to build up by that point. And they weren't convinced that Finley was going to back down, and they were, as you know, prepared to strike. They weren't going to play unless Mike Andrews was reinstated.
Yeah.
And they made that point clear. They told NBC, we ain't playing.
Yeah, they were just that angry. I could not get any of the players to admit that they really felt a strike was going to come off.
No.
I think they realized to a man that they were going to end up playing regardless.
Did you feel the level of bitterness even after all these years?
Oh yeah, they were angry. And just the threat of the strike sent the entire operation into a tizzy. I mean, NBC had a game to broadcast, and if it didn't come off, they'd have to figure out alternative programming. What ended up happening was Bowie Kuhn, the commissioner, who hated Charlie Finley just as much as Charlie Finley hated Bowie Kuhn, ordered Finley to reinstate Andrews. And talking to Steve Bucinich, the A's clubhouse guy, the current clubhouse manager who was with the team back then, has been with them since 1968, told me he was back in Oakland, and he got an emergency call from Finley's secretary, Carolyn Kaufman. Is that Carolyn Kaufman?
Coffin.
Yeah,
Coffin.
Kaufman, that's right. Saying, we got to find Mike Andrews. Nobody knew where he was. And they didn't reach him at home. Someone thought he was on a hunting trip. And so they literally started opening phone books. And Vucinich was saying, yeah, I knew he was from San Diego, so they started looking for Andrewses and calling Andrewses in San Diego. No one could find him. It turns out he went home, and whoever was tasked with finding him there just failed. He was back home in Massachusetts, and they pulled him into the ballpark for Game 4. And Charlie Finley was so upset by this that he ordered Dick Williams, do not let this guy see the field under any circumstances. And Dick Williams, because he had had enough of Finley by that point as anybody, sent Andrews up to pinch hit at the earliest available opportunity. And the New York Mets fans in Shea Stadium, God bless them, gave Mike Andrews, a visiting player, a standing ovation.
There were about 8 people sitting, Finley and his family.
Yeah.
And everybody else was-
Yeah, what'd you make of that in the press box?
Well, it was wonderful. It was stunning. It actually gave us chills. I mean, it really did. And there's very little except maybe, the Game 7, when you see them finally win, you'd have that feeling. But it was really a special moment. You sort of just imagine yourself being back there, seeing this happen, and see those Mets fans, rise to their feet and give them a great ovation. And just the players were so happy. They were giddy, and they were giddy in the dugout, and they were so happy after the game, which I believe they lost. Game 4.
They did lose.
Yeah.
They did lose it.
But they made their point.
And this is the Mets fans who were accused during the National League playoffs against the Reds of being the greatest ruffians the sport had ever seen. They had to file the Reds' wives out through the field because they were afraid that they would be attacked if they left through the stands. These Mets fans pulled it together and gave Charlie Finley the what for. And that was Mike Andrews' last at bat in the major leagues. He was, I don't know if he was blackballed, but his fears came true. He was worried that if he signed that document attesting to his injury, that it might ruin him, and he ended up being right about that.
So 1974, on the eve of the World Series, what do we learn about Catfish?
We learn about Catfish that he hasn't been paid. Catfish Hunter, before the 1974 season, signed a 2-year contract with Finley for $100,000 per season. He didn't really know it at the time because salaries were not out in the open prior to arbitration, but he was being well underpaid. It didn't bother him. He'd always wanted 6 figures. Finley offered him 6 figures. He accepted it. On the advice of his attorney back home in North Carolina, he's from rural North Carolina. His attorney was a guy with the prototypical Southern gentleman nickname of J. Carlton Cherry. Suggested, take half your salary, put it in a life insurance annuity that you can cash in later, after your career's over, when your tax bracket is much lower, you're not earning nearly as much. That will make sense. Hunter presented it to Finley. Finley had had arrangements like that with other players wherein he deferred their salary.
Made money for them.
He made me, well, that's a different story.
Yeah.
But Reggie Jackson, for example, took a large chunk of his salary. Finley kept it and paid it out as Jackson requested years later. The difference being with deferred salary, Finley held onto it and paid no taxes. When he had to pay it into a life insurance annuity, he had to give it up immediately and was on the hook for the taxes. He didn't understand that when he agreed to the deal. And as soon as he did understand it, he tried to back out of it. He tried to give Hunter that extra $50,000 every which way but the annuity. And Hunter kept saying, no, pay me the way the contract says and we'll be fine. Up until the World Series, these conversations were happening. Hunter was not trying to use these details for contract leverage. He, in fact, did not want the story broken at all. He didn't want it talked about until after the postseason. But one of the people he had told, former teammate Mike Hirschberger, spoke to Jerome Holtzman of the Chicago Sun-Times, and the story broke. And once the story broke, Hunter said, well, I got nothing to lose. I'll discuss it right here. And people couldn't believe it. The A's are trying to play the World Series, and here's their best pitcher talking about becoming a free agent because his owner has not paid his contract according to the stipulations. Finley didn't think anything about it, and you can probably speak to this firsthand. He thought it would blow over, that he would, he brought Lee MacPhail, the American League president, into the clubhouse with a check for $50,000, tried to give it to Hunter. Hunter said, that's not what my contract says. And Finley says, look, I tried to pay him, he won't take it. And MacPhail was on his side. How big a distraction was it for the guys covering the team? You had to cover the World Series, and suddenly there's this whole other issue.
It was hovering over everything, but the series was so compelling in itself. And this was, they're going for their third title in a row, and they split the games in LA, and then of course swept the games in Oakland. But every day, as I recall, there was some sort of an update. It might have been a notebook or something, or a column written about Catfish. And enjoy it now because he's going to be gone in all likelihood. Finley, like you say, was persistent in fighting it, and I think up until, well, maybe not New Year's Eve when Catfish signed with the Yankees, but I'd say into December he thought he was still going to win somehow.
Yeah, he did. It eventually went to an arbitrator who ruled that effectively for the price of $25,000 worth of taxes that Finley owed, which is the entire reason he was balking at this deal, Catfish would be a free agent. He was pitching under contract default. And so instead of making $100,000 for Charlie Finley in 1975, he turned around and signed with the New York Yankees for $3.8 million over 5 years. And that was really the first true free agent and gave baseball players a great idea of what they might be worth on the open market. They had no idea before then. I mean, the reports leading up to the bidding process said, Catfish might fetch as much as $1 million over a ton of years. And that was blown out of the water on the first day. And that really set the stage for the seasons to come. Arbitration came in the following year, in which players who were playing out their contracts would submit a salary figure, and the ownership would submit another figure, and the arbitrator would select one or the other with no room for compromise. And Finley was really the main voice in ownership against that. He was a canny businessman. And like you said, he would invest players' money for them. In the early days before their relationship grew so antagonistic, he would play the stock market, and he would do very, very well. He made millions in the insurance industry. He all but invented group insurance policies for medical professionals, but he made millions more playing the stock market. And he would take players' salaries, whatever portion they wanted, invest them on their behalf, and they would as much as double their outlay. Finley even guaranteed it. Like, if the stocks tanked, he would still return all their money. It was an unbelievable service, and that went away after the '73 World Series, along with every other nicety he offered for them. In fact, Glenn has a World Series ring on right now.
It's a prop that I'll show you later.
The '72 World Series ring was beautiful. It was gaudier than almost any ring they'd ever seen in baseball history. A beautiful diamond. Finley designed the ring himself. He gave them full-size replica trophies, the players. That was unheard of. He did many, many nice things. After the '73 World Series, when his players soured on him over the Mike Andrews affair, he withdrew it all. And the World Series rings, including the one Glenn has on his hand right now, have no diamonds. They have green glass.
Damn it.
Yeah. Ken Holtzman, again, said he would use it as a fishing weight.
Yeah, trash rings, as they
Yeah.
called them.
Yeah, but I mean, it's still a beautiful, beautiful piece of memorabilia from afar. So Hunter left. Arbitration came in. The following year, free agency came in. Players across baseball understood really for the first time what they were worth. Finley never adapted. He couldn't wrap his brain around players having a say in their own future. The guy was a fabulous autocrat. He was really good when he called all the shots. His team was very successful, but he struggled at letting anyone else have a say. And when players were obligated to a say, he didn't know what to do with it. And by 1976, players were making multi-year contract offers to him, saying, lock us up for the duration, we'll stay here. They didn't know it at the time, but they were below market value offers. By the end of the season, they were way below market value. Finley tried to take them up on them months after they had made the offers, None of the players were interested by the end of 1976. Everybody walked. And notably, across the country, George Steinbrenner, a guy who understood baseball's new financial rules inherently in ways that Finley never could or would or wanted to, ended up winning back-to-back World Series with Finley's two best players, Reggie Jackson and Catfish Hunter.
Yeah, I remember Finley advocating all one-year contracts, which would have been interesting because he didn't want to pay anybody if they had a bad year. And then he was trying to convince the owners that that's what we should do. Everybody gets a one-year deal.
Yeah, he wanted every player to be a free agent every single year.
Yep.
Once free agency was adopted. And it seems ludicrous, but Marvin Miller, the godfather of the union, the man who probably shaped modern baseball more than anyone else, it's a crime that he's not in the Hall of Fame. He was the union head. That was the only proposal that scared him. Like, he knew that his players would be making lots more money under free agency unless Finley's plan was adopted. But because he was Charlie Finley, because he had no interest in making friends, because he wanted only to have his voice be the main voice all the time, he wasn't particularly well liked among ownership. And the fact that this idea came from Finley hindered it on its surface, and it was never considered for adoption.
I told you that I thought your psychological profile of Finley was brilliant, as you wrote near the end of the book, when you talk a little bit about what, the duality of Charlie and how he was a man of extremes. There was generous side to him, and obviously a tremendous innovator, and yet there were all these other characteristics which harmed the players that worked for him.
Yeah, actually, there's a little passage. There's a couple things I want to read here. This one speaks to his innovation. There are some curse words here, which I will truncate for the children in the room, but just know that Finley did not truncate his own curse words. In recent years, the owner had bandied about the idea of three-ball walks as a means of creating additional offense. Such was Finley's fervor that in 1971, he convinced American League President Joe Cronin to sign off on a spring training experiment wherein the A's and the Brewers played an exhibition game under the rule. Finley was right about the extra base runners, but 19 walks and 6 home runs later, there wasn't much clamor for a repeat performance. Uncowed, the owner claimed additional permission from Bowie Kuhn to implement the three-ball walk format in additional spring training games that year. Never mind that baseball's Rules Committee denied his request before it ever reached the commissioner. Thus was Angels manager Lefty Phillips surprised upon showing up in Mesa and being informed that three-ball walks were in effect for that day's game. The A's director of minor league operations, Phil Segui, handled his end of the bargain by greeting the arriving umpires in the stadium parking lot while waving around a piece of paper that he described as official consent to use the three-ball format. It was actually just an A's press release describing the plan. When the umpires were unable to confirm Segui's claim with league officials, they called Finley himself in Chicago. Of course it's legit, he told them, and furthermore, we don't need approval from the visiting club. With no further information upon which to base their decision, the umps relented. 3 balls it was. Angels general manager Dick Walsh called Finley to straighten things out, but the conversation lasted only moments. Before anyone around Walsh knew what was happening, he hung up the phone in shock and proclaimed, "He called me an effing idiot." "I did not call Mr. Walsh an effing idiot," Finley later clarified. "I told him to quit acting like an effing idiot." Walsh nearly packed his team back onto the bus, but the possibility of being liable for ticket refunds swayed his decision to stay. The game featured 16 bases on balls, and the experiment was officially killed shortly thereafter. So I think that illustrates Finley's need to be right and his need not to make friends. And he was a gruff guy. Was he like that with you?
Absolutely, although Bergman, the beat writer for the Oakland Tribune, took most of the abuse because Ron covered the team every day from spring training to the last game of the year for 9 years. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a lot of things, and as you know, Ron had a very wicked sense of humor.
Yes.
And he was not one to pull any punches when writing about Finley or Finley's announcers, whom he couldn't stand because they were always just promoting Charlie more than the club. So most of my phone conversations with Finley were complaining about the coverage he was getting. I used to change the phone line in the office and transfer him over to Wells Twombly, who was our acerbic columnist whom Finley couldn't stand, and let them spar, and I could listen to them fight. But Plus, Charlie he would wear you out on the phone because he had this idiosyncratic way of talking, and he'd modulate his voice. And Schwartz, I want to tell you, Bowie Kuhn, the village idiot, has done it again. And this would go on and on and on. Even in the off season, he would find you and want to vent about something because he hated Kuhn, who was, as you mentioned, it was feuding with him for many years. But he was entertaining, he was exasperating, and sometimes just exhausting to cover because you're covering the game, you're writing about the clubhouse, and then you're writing about what Charlie had to say on the phone.
Right. And that's the thing. Finley had this unique ability, as far as I can tell, to be on the phone for hours
He was
every
physically
day.
attached to it. He was just, there was no way he was going to ever give up the phone from his office.
Yeah, I mean, he was his own general manager. The guy, he wasn't a baseball man. He didn't know how to evaluate talent like a scout does.
He picked everybody's brain.
He would spend hours on the phone calling general managers and other executives and scouts in the guise of trade talks and gather opinions on his own players and their players and unrelated players.
There was even speculation that he was paying some scouts from other teams under the table to find out what their assessment was of players. You keep them on the phone long enough, they tell him anything, give them enough drinks later.
For sure. And he would do the same thing with his players, not on the phone, in person. He'd just talk to them long enough, he'd pick up information, and no one knew how he knew so much of the inner workings of the clubhouse. I mean, there was a time, you told me about a time when he tracked you down at a girlfriend's apartment.
Yes, a recent girlfriend. And I had not given out, I don't remember giving the number out to anybody. And obviously I did to one person, and I never found out who it was. And he found me on an off day. He wanted to talk. So there I was, trapped.
Unreal. Yeah, and the guy had his own phone in the front rows of the lower boxes in the Oakland Coliseum. He had a phone to call places, including his own dugout.
Dugout often. Yeah.
Dugout. I mean, he would call the dugout so frequently with suggestions and orders that Dick Williams once had a coach answer the phone and tell him I'm not here. Crazy.
Want to talk about the clubhouse scene and the fights?
Sure. The other facet of this team that really stuck with me, there were a couple. I mean, one is the mustaches, and we can talk about that in a minute, that really set the standard for baseball for years. I mean, well, let's talk about it right now. The Major League Baseball had been a facial hair-free zone for the entire 20th century, all through the 1900s. It had been a clean-shaven place. It had been seen as something of a ruffian sport back in the 1800s when it was just getting established. They wanted to claim a more genteel audience, some people with some money and class and maybe some women. And thus
Everybody got dressed up in the stands, the coat and ties and the dresses.
And the players, there was an unofficial ban on facial hair up until Reggie Jackson showed up in the clubhouse.
With a beard.
In 1972, the year of their first World Series. It was his teammates who didn't like it. They knew they would never be able to convince the egotistical Reggie Jackson to shave. So they hatched a plan wherein they would grow their own mustaches. And Finley would see them and issue a blanket rebuke, order everybody to shave. Instead, because he was Charlie Finley, he said, promotional opportunity, $300, everyone grow your own mustache. Then Ken Holtzman said, I'll grow one on my feet. Yeah. By June 18th, the day of the team photo, which was also Father's Day, which he turned into Mustache Day at the ballpark, and any man with a mustache got in at a discount. And the A's won the World Series that year, and suddenly every team around baseball had a mustache. And like 10 minutes later, we have Brian Wilson. That's one thing they were known for. The other,
Not the Beach Boy, Brian.
not the Beach Boy. The other thing they were known for was their fighting. They got into a crazy number of intramural fistfights, not with other teams, with each other in the clubhouse, over all kinds of things. And I think this passage describes it fairly well.
And the passage he's going to read that year, a radio interviewer asked Ron Bergman if the clubhouse fights were overblown. And Ron replied, no, they were underblown.
So this is describing the scene prior to Game 1 of the 1974 World Series in Los Angeles. Friday was workout day at Dodger Stadium, prior to Saturday's Game 1. For the first All-California World Series, it seemed like every member of the Los Angeles media, not to mention the usual throng from around the country, had packed into the visitors' clubhouse. Ken Holtzman was pulling on his uniform when a herd of Chicago scribes approached his locker, smiles on every face. Jim Enright, Dave Nightingale, and Dick Dozier, who all knew the left-hander from his time with the Cubs, sought two things: to offer congratulations and to figure out what the heck was up with this body-brawling team. "We read about you guys all the time, and I can't believe some of it," said Nightingale. "Is it just hype? What's really going on?" I should also point out that, again, curse words will be scrubbed. While Nightingale spoke, Raleigh Fingers and Blue Moon Odom walked one after the other through the clubhouse door. As Fingers approached his locker adjacent to the stall at which Holtzman was entertaining the Chicago media, Odom called out from his own locker across the room, "Hey, Raleigh, do you need any extra tickets?" This was not an uncommon question, especially during the World Series, when tickets were scarce and requests could be overwhelming. Still, the timing was odd. Fingers looked up quizzically, unsure about Odom's motivation. Even as the question was being asked, clubhouse attendant Jim Muhay was on the far side of the room, approaching Sal Bando's locker. This was his 14th year as visiting clubhouse manager, and he felt a bit foolish about the question he wanted to ask. He looked around furtively to see if anybody was listening, then unloaded something that had been on his mind since the A's eliminated Baltimore in the playoffs. "I'm nervous with you guys in here," he admitted to the captain. Bando was confused. Oakland only just arrived in town. There hadn't yet been time for anybody to pull any tricks. He asked Muhay what was on his mind. "All the stuff I've heard about, the way you fight all the time," Muhay answered. "I've never had to deal with anything like that." Bando chuckled. Down the row of lockers, Fingers stared across at Odom. "No," he said curtly. "I don't need any extra tickets, thanks. I've got enough." "Oh," said Odom. "I thought you might need one for your wife's boyfriend." At that moment, Holtzman knew what was about to happen. "Oh, God, here we go," he said aloud. Across the room, Bando, still speaking with Muhay, smiled at the clubby. He thought it patently absurd that his team's reputation could have such a profound effect on somebody who hadn't so much as met most of the players. Sure, the Reggie Jackson-Billy North scuffle earned some headlines, but that was back in June. And Blue Moon Odom and Vida Blue, that fight was in 1972, a lifetime ago. "That stuff is overblown," Bando said. "We don't fight any more than any other team. As a matter of fact, we love each other." With the phrase "love each other," Fingers charged, murder on his mind. The mustachioed reliever grabbed hold of a nearby cart used to transport dirty laundry and pushed it as hard as he could toward Odom. It bounced along the floor, wheels squeaking, and crashed into Odom's ankle just before Fingers swooped in with a one-handed shove that sent his opponent sprawling. For Odom, it was only an opening salvo. The guy hadn't missed any time after being shot, for crying out loud. A laundry cart and an awkward right hand weren't about to slow him down. He was shot in the offseason, by the way, and he did not miss any time. That he was the smaller man by some 4 inches and 15 pounds didn't faze him. Odom leaped to his feet, lowered his shoulder, and charged headlong into Fingers' chest, knocking the reliever backward into a locker. As the pitcher fell, his head glanced off a clothes hook and was cut open, blood flowing freely down his neck and onto the floor. Unlike earlier fights, this one didn't require anybody to break it up. Odom got up limping, and Fingers didn't get up at all, remaining seated and gripping his head. Within moments, a score of teammates raced between the players, shouting at Odom, at Fingers, at each other. The clubhouse had gone from a scene of cheery anticipation to something approaching an English soccer riot. Dozier, wide-eyed, turned to Holtzman. "Kenny, I apologize," the newsman said. "I will never doubt you when you say that you guys are effing crazy." Enright shook his head. "I thought it was all BS," he said in disbelief, "but you guys take the cake." Across the room, Muhay, mouth agape, turned uneasily toward Bando. "Get out of here," he said, backing away. Upon realizing that he couldn't toss the A's out of their own dressing room, the clubby ejected himself, running out the door and down the hall into the home clubhouse, where he announced, "Those guys over there are killing each other. There's blood all over the place." Hunter applied pressure to Fingers' scalp until trainer Joe Romo could wrap a towel around the reliever's head. As Fingers was helped up, Odom, ankle smarting from the cart's impact, limped over, hand extended in truce. Fingers took it. "The Fighting A's," screamed Gene Tennis. "I love it!"
Yeah, they emerged from the clubhouse like the fife and drum corps, the bandages and Odom limping and Raleigh wrapped.
He literally had a bandage on his
Yeah,
head.
hit the hook on the locker. Yeah.
That's crazy. What did you make of that scene?
Well, I was, regrettably, I missed all these fights, including the one in Detroit. I was not in the clubhouse for any of them, but I was nearby. I was on the field, and of course, I had to assess the damage when they came out. But, it was true. And obviously, there were some things that we didn't know about. In fact, you wrote about Campaneris going after Reggie after one of the World Series parties with a knife.
With a knife.
With a knife.
Media was not around for that. That was a players-only party.
Right.
This was how the players relaxed.
Right.
And Campy was apparently bitter over Reggie winning the MVP of the
Yeah.
73 World Series. Campaneris had been the odds-on favorite when the series came back to Oakland for the last two games, and then had a very good last two games. Reggie had an even better last two games. The distinction being that the MVP award was presented by the Sporting News. And Campaneris didn't say anything to anybody. Even the Spanish-speaking player said, this one quiet dude, and he barely spoke English. The Sporting News knew that if Reggie got it, it would be an endless fountain of quotes, and thus they gave it to him. And I think Campy really got over that, even though he deserved it.
Yep. Yeah, I don't recall the writers being in the room for the Mike Epstein attempted chokeout of Reggie either, or the Billy North fight with Reggie in Detroit.
Yeah, how happy were the players to recreate those things for you?
Oh, they couldn't wait for us to get into the clubhouse. They couldn't wait for anything they wanted to say about the game or each other or Finley. I mean, there was nothing off limits. And it was just every day you look forward to going down there because the game would often become secondary. And you knew your story would probably be out of the clubhouse rather than what happened in the field. You'd weave in a few game details. And I want to say also that the circus atmosphere surrounding the A's and their pugilistic reputation extended beyond the clubhouse because after one World Series game, they used to have the World Series parties in the exhibit hall in between the Coliseum and the arena. And Finley would invite his friends and family there, and there were media and all kinds of preferred season ticket holders. And at this gathering after one World Series game, the A's PR guy was trading punches with one of the revelers, and Finley had his mule, his mascot, Charlie O the mule, in there. And unfortunately, and I witnessed this, the mule backed his swishing tail into the potato salad.
Which remained on the buffet?
Well, it was quickly removed at my urging.
That's funny. I mean, there's a picture I remember of Charlie O the mule in a banquet,
Yeah.
like with Stan Musial. It was-
Yeah, he was in the hotel. He was in the hotel in New York when we were there.
Oh yeah, I mean Finley dragged him around the country
Yeah.
in an air-conditioned trailer that the players insisted was more plush than their own accommodations. And there's a great story of Finley wanting to bring Charlie O the mule. He bought a mule, a Missouri mule, as a mascot and named it after himself. I think that says something about the guy. He wanted to bring it to Chicago, to bring on the field in White Sox Stadium, and Arthur Allen, the White Sox owner, wouldn't let him. So Finley's response was to rent a smaller mule. Charlie O was gigantic. He rented a smaller mule in Chicago, don't ask me where, fit it into an A's cargo box that was ostensibly used to transport equipment, smuggled it into the stadium, and had Ken Harrelson, this was in the late 60s, lead it out on the field. Harrelson was happy to do it, because what did he care? And it got loose, and Arthur Allen was just glowering. He was so angry, and Finley was in the dugout. Harrelson told me this, like laughing, his side-splitting laughter. He thought it was the funniest thing ever. And it was ultimately up to Harrelson to bring the mule back. He finally got it by the lead rope, and as he was dragging it back into the dugout, the mule stepped on his foot, and he ended up on the disabled list. But that's how things ran around there.
And then Finley later fired him, right?
And Finley later
Became a
fired him.
free agent.
Oh, I mean, that's catfish before catfish.
Yeah.
Another incident that is too long to get in detail, but Harrelson ended up calling Finley, according to media accounts, a menace to baseball. That was printed in newspapers worldwide. It ended up in Finley wanting to fire both his manager, Alvin Dark, and Ken Harrelson. Harrelson was making $12,000 a year at that point. He was the A's best hitter. He immediately turned around and signed a $150,000 contract with Boston.
Yeah.
And as soon as Finley realized what he had done, before Harrelson was snapped up somewhere else, he called him and said, "Ken, I acted rashly. I would like you to come back to the A's." And Harrelson said, "No way."
This was in the 60s.
Yeah, it was in 1967.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were your most memorable interviews, or what do you think were the best interviews over those 2 years when you were doing your work on this book?
Well, I met a former sports editor of the Chronicle out here in Pleasant Hill at a restaurant. That was very enlightening. I mean, honestly, you and the other journalists helped set the groundwork for what I should expect from the players, and it was unbelievably helpful. But the thing about these guys talking to them 40 years later is inevitably their memories are shaky. And I ended up informing the players about their own lives in ways that was kind of blowing their minds. Because I was living in it. I read all the Oakland Tribunes and the sporting newses, and I knew all the details that they had long since forgotten. And me recounting things for them helped spur them to say, "Oh yeah, and this also happened." Dick Green in South Carolina took me to Mount Rushmore during the polar vortex. It was so cold in South Carolina. I mean, I just figured that was how it always was. But
South Dakota.
South Dakota, excuse me.
Yeah.
The locals were freaking out how cold it was, and I realized at that point -15 is pretty cold. And we sat in the dining room, the lodge. No one was there. We were the only people there, looking at the presidents looming above us for 2 hours while we talked, among other locations in South Dakota. Guys were really open and available to a surprising degree. Even Raleigh Fingers, who was standoffish at first, I called him. He said, "Where'd you get this number?" I said, "You gave it to me back in Oakland." He said, "Oh, okay." And then we talked for 4 hours. I went down to see him in Henderson, Nevada. Raleigh's not a great example of this, but for the most part, these guys' identities and legacies as ball players is wrapped up in this team. They're known as members of the Oakland A's. And I think they knew and know that because this team is underserved in the historical record, that they are subsequently underserved in the historical record. Dick Green is one of the great fielding second basemen of all time. He's all but forgotten to history.
If he'd have had 2 hits in that World Series, he'd have been the MVP.
If he'd had 1 hit in that World Series, he'd been the MVP. He batted 0. His defense was so spectacular that he had a sizable contingent of support to be the MVP, but he literally batted 0 in that entire World Series, and the voters could not give it to him.
He caught everything, and then he made the great relay throw that nabbed Buckner in Game 5.
Yeah. He was great. But, all these guys, Joe Rudy, even Sal Bando, understand that if my goal is to improve the standing of the team historically, then their standing will subsequently improve also. And I think that helped them be so open. And they're far enough away from the game where they're not going to be hurt by anything they say. And I wasn't looking for the spectacular. I was looking for the true. And
You got it.
well, sometimes
As I remember it.
it's difficult because I heard some amazing stories from guys, like jaw-dropping, "Oh my God, that happened" stories that I couldn't get other guys to corroborate. Gene Tennis's details about that fight between Mike Epstein and Reggie Jackson were unbelievable, but no one else remembered it the way he remembers it. And so I had to leave a lot of things out, which is okay because there's plenty to hang my hat on, and the A's hat on.
What about your encounter with Reggie?
The one guy who is not represented firsthand in this book is Reggie Jackson. It's not for lack of trying. He has a handler who I must have emailed literally 100 times, back and forth. Reggie spends half his year in Seaside, just down the coast. He has an auto garage there. He collects classic cars. And I tried so hard to set something up. And finally, this guy, his handler was like, "Look, quit asking me for attention. Like, I can't help you anymore. If Reggie wants to talk to you, he'll talk to you. Here's when he will be there." And I went with it. I went down to Seaside, and I went to the auto garage, and I saw a locked door and like a 1964 Corvette out front with a wet rag on the fender, as if someone had been washing it and then had to leave. So clearly someone was there. And I parked, and I sat in my car, and I watched that garage as if I was in CSI Seaside. I was on my stakeout for Reggie Jackson. It was really kind of funny. And he eventually pulled up, and I walked down and I said, "Hi, Mr. Jackson." He was messing with some golf clubs in the back of his car, his SUV. There's golf clubs, and there was a stack of Yankees caps, and he didn't even turn around. He literally did not turn around to talk to me. He talked to me with his back turned. And I mentioned that I'd been trying very hard to talk to him for this book, and ultimately, he just wanted to be paid. And as you know, journalistic standards do not allow for that, nor do budgets of independent writers. And so luckily Reggie was on the record, literally no exaggeration, probably as much as the rest of the A's combined during those years. He was the guy who loved the spotlight, and generally speaking, the A's were happy to cede it to him. And so I have plenty of Reggie's ideas and opinions in here, just none that were expressed directly to me.
I don't remember him turning his back to me, but he was mercurial. He ran hot and cold. You had to talk to him almost every day, even if Catfish pitched a two-hitter. You had to start with Reggie and then work your way over to the other principals. But he was a complex guy. Although I will say, my first trip with the A's, where we went to Boston and New York, and they had a Blue Sunday. You mentioned about the attendance. The Yankees were terrible and were drawing 12,000. They drew 47,000.
Blue Sunday being a promotion for Vita Blue in Yankee Stadium.
Yeah. And we were in Washington, and I was, fresh on the beat, and walked into a nearby restaurant to the hotel, and Reggie was in there eating by himself, and he called me over, and we had dinner together, which I'll never forget. It was cool.
Well, when he wanted to be personable, he knew how to be personable.
Absolutely, yeah. Then 2 days later, I met Richard Nixon. Well, because he wanted to meet Vida.
Yeah.
Not the San Francisco Examiner correspondent, so.
Yeah, Richard Nixon chimed in that Vita Blue was the most underpaid player in baseball during 1971.
Yeah, and I was fortunate because my publisher at the time, Charles Gould, was a big Republican supporter and a supporter of Nixon from his time in California. So when I was introduced by Dick Williams to the president, Nixon wanted to ask about his good friend Charles Gould, and then also the Giants were doing well that year, and so we got to chat a little bit about being in the Bay Area with two winning clubs at that time. So I got about a minute and a half with him, and I still have a photo of shaking hands with Tricky Dick.
You and Elvis.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, and did you have any less ideal run-ins with Reggie?
Not
How
really.
bad could Reggie get?
Not really, no. I mean, he would get on your case once in a while, and if you wrote something, he would ice you, much like Dick Williams. You get shorter answers the next day if you wrote something that he didn't appreciate. But for the most part, he was on most of the time.
And Dick Williams is his own character. I think he's underserved in this story.
They would never have been what they became without Dick Williams, because he was a great motivator. He was tough on them. He taught them how to play the game. He taught them how to emphasize fundamentals. And the players, I'm sure, told you that he didn't abide many mistakes. I mean, and he would call them on it right away. If they get back to the dugout, he would call them on it right there.
Yeah, Billy North said, I used to say that Dick Williams would go to the bathroom on you. I looked at him, I was like, what? He's like, yeah, in the dugout there, we had a bathroom. And when he got really mad, he'd lock himself in the bathroom and scream to the heavens. I was like, oh, that's what you mean. And I heard from multiple players just in passing, oh yeah, there's Dick Williams in the bathroom screaming again. He was a tough guy. And in the pantheon of things, one of the things that set this team apart from other great teams was that they executed so perfectly, so consistently.
Yep.
They didn't take any plays off. They knew exactly what was happening. You referenced this play earlier in the 1974 World Series when Bill Buckner, in a key moment, hit a ball that Billy North overran. It got behind him.
Yeah.
Reggie Jackson was on it, and Reggie has been accused of flagging hustle multiple times over his career. There was no way he would have caught up with that ball had he not been sprinting after it from the moment it was hit. He caught it in center field. He relayed it to Dick Green perfectly before he even knew where Dick Green was set up, because he knew where Dick Green was going to be set up. Green knew exactly where Bando wanted the ball.
Didn't even look, just turned and
Turning
fired
through.
it.
That was all fundamentals that Williams had hammered them from the moment he took over in 1971. And Tennis told me, like, he got there in 71 and he took the bats away. He wouldn't let us hit until we could run these fundamentals right in spring training. And it just got better and better.
Yep.
And he was the right guy in the right time. I think we are ready for some questions, if anyone has one.
I have a microphone, so I'm going to come around so everyone can hear.
Do you have any history about the A's and Finley in Kansas City when they had the farm team in Birmingham, where a lot of those great players started from? And I just learned about it a few months ago, and I thought, do you have any stories about how that connection was made and the development of the A's started in Kansas City?
Well, I don't know that Finley established the team in Birmingham or the connection with the team.
That was their minor league club, and before the draft, before Bando and Jackson and some of the others were drafted, they were just signing players like Rudy and Catfish, and some of those guys went through Birmingham, the Southern League, where the A's had Ricketts Field, where we went for an exhibition game that was subsequently rained out. But I remember there was Joe Rudy telling the story, and I think it was in Birmingham.
It was in Birmingham, yes.
Where Reggie couldn't find a place to rent, and Joe and his wife took in Reggie at their apartment to stay when Reggie was playing in Birmingham.
And because it was Birmingham, the landlord said, "Get that black guy out of my building." And Joe Rudy said, "Shove off." I think that's literally the phrase he described it to me with. "Shove off. This is my friend, and he's staying here." And that was the same complex that Mamie Van Doren lived in.
Okay.
Because she was married to Bobulinski,
Yes.
right? Another minor leaguer who was not with the A's.
No, he was an angel.
Yeah. So Joe Rudy said they used to love to kind of just sneak around and watch Mamie Van Doren
The
sunbathing.
actors, Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that before that exhibition game that I referenced that was rained out, Finley brought Bear Bryant around to talk to the players
Right.
at the hotel, which he did in an earlier year in Oakland.
Yeah.
About motivation and how difficult it is to repeat as a champion. And I remember we flew to New York that night on the charter, and this reflects how the relationship has changed over the years between the media and players, and how, even off the field, we were very friendly and would, have a meal or drinks. And we got to New York that night after flying from Birmingham, and Ron Bergman and I went over to the Carnegie Delicatessen, and Fingers and Holtzman called us over and said, "Hey, come on, let's have a sandwich." And so we had a 2 a.m. deli sandwich at the Carnegie Deli.
They didn't ask you to play any bridge,
No bridge. Ron was a very good bridge
as
player.
was Fingers and Holtzman.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something.
That's my Birmingham story.
Over here. Did you have a question? Okay.
Hi. I have 2 questions. I hope that's not too many. The first question is, I was born in 1961, and I'm a native Northern Californian. So I had the opportunity to go to all of the World Series and playoffs throughout that era. And what I always found unusual was that, among my classmates, I was probably the only A's fan. So when I would brag to my classmates that I skipped school in the afternoon because my parents took me to the World Series, they were not impressed. And I always found that a bit odd, that to have a team so close geographically, it never captured the imagination of the Northern California community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think pertinent to what you're saying about the A's not being reflected in the historical record, I guess, what is it about the A's that didn't really capture a sense of geographical loyalty? Because, all of my friends were Giants fans,
Mm-hmm.
and most of my friends today are Giants fans.
Yeah.
And I always assumed that it was sort of that the Giants were the first to come to the Bay Area. They preceded the A's. The Giants were National League, and somehow that was a pure form of baseball than the American League. The Giants had Willie Mays at the time, a nationally known superstar. And I guess in your opinion, what is it that prevented the A's from having that kind of geographic loyalty and recognition that would propel them into, the loyalty that could sustain them and also promote them into Hall of Fame and nationwide imagination?
Well, I think it's twofold. One, when Finley decided to move here in '68, prior to the move, he was told by pretty much everybody in baseball that the Bay Area was not a 2-team market, that that moving the A's here would siphon off enough Giants fans to put two teams in perilous financial straits rather than keep one team healthy. But because Finley was an iconoclast, he liked to buck conventional wisdom. He actually hired a research firm to study the pros and cons of the Bay Area and he ordered it, tell me to move to Oakland. And there was a 50,000 seat brand new Coliseum here. There was reasons to move. But ultimately, I think it's because he never had any interest or investment in the community. He promised to move here with the team and never did. He never left Chicago or Indiana. He never integrated his players or his team into the fabric of the community. His speakers bureau was minimal. He barely sent his players out. And the easiest counterbalance to that is to look right across the Oakland Coliseum. The other tenants, the other team that played there is the Oakland Raiders. And Al Davis was Mr. Oakland. Those Raiders were all about Oakland, and they sold out every game. Fans loved Al Davis. They never found out about Charlie Finley because he didn't want to be found out. And I think that really cost him.
And he had no marketing department. I mean, he would have good promotions, some of them were hokey, but he had Mustache Day, but those
Hot Pants Day.
Hot Pants Day would draw 25, 30,000, and then there'd be 4,000 there on a Tuesday night. Mm-hmm. And from a media perspective, the largest newspaper in Northern California, the Chronicle, which had 600,000 circulation at the time, pretty much ignored the A's. They never traveled with the A's. They did not cover the A's. The Oakland Tribune did, wire to wire. Some of those years the Mercury did. I covered as much as the budget at the Examiner would allow. But the Chronicle would just stay, A's road game, you'd pick up the paper the next day and it would be our correspondent. It would just be a rewrite of the wire services. And that was a big factor because, a paper of that size and influence not covering the team.
Well, the Giants ownership lavished the reporters with expense accounts, and they paid for their travel. They paid for all kinds of things.
Paid meal money and
Yeah.
picked up the tab for the hotel, and Finley would not pay for the writers to travel.
Yeah,
So newspapers had to pick up their own tab.
Right. Finley was told by Walter O'Malley, if I'm not mistaken, you don't have to do this. And Finley said, all right, I'm going to save a buck. And thus the Chronicle focused on the Giants, the team that was paying their reporters to go cover them.
Literally.
And yeah, literally. And had no interest in Finley, which was incredibly short-sighted on his part. But that was kind of the way he was.
Anybody else? Questions?
Was this the same era that they did the Ken Harrelson deal when he bit his nose to spite his face or whatever? He cut Ken Harrelson.
Yeah, that was just before this. That was 1967 when the teams were when the team was in Kansas City. The year before it moved to Oakland. The details in that are unbelievable. Too many to get into. This book, when I turned it in, the manuscript was 310,000 words. The product here is about 140,000 words. My editor was not eager to publish a 950-page book. And most of the stuff that got cut out was the Kansas City here. So that story is fantastic on so many levels, but it just ended up being redundant for the things that came later in terms of this is who Charlie Finley is. So yeah, he bit off his nose to spite his face is a great way to put it. Casey Shiner?
I was wondering why he named his mule Charlie O, not Charlie F.
Oh, because his middle name was Oscar. He
Oh.
was known as Charlie Finley's name was Charlie O. They called him Charlie O and Charlie O Finley. And you would think that naming a mule after yourself would lead to jokes about the jackass of the A's and his mule. But he didn't care.
And I was also wondering what your closest connections were to Finley in your interviewing process.
Well, Finley died in 1997, I believe, so I did not talk to him. But I did talk to his son, Paul. His family is very guarded. I think they understand that most of the people who want to examine their father right now are going to find some not so pleasant details. So Paul Finley started off the conversation by saying, I don't want to talk to you and I will not talk to you. And then we spoke for about 45 minutes. And I got some good details. But yeah, and from what I understand, he was not the best dad and not the best husband, but that's, it's only partially relevant to the team, so I didn't talk about it too much in the book.
That was another thing that was going on in '73 when he had the heart attack. His divorce was proceeding. And,
Yes. He was leaving he was getting left by his wife as they won their second World Series.
Well, how many of like his advisor, like people who worked for him, his GMs, his scouts, those kind of people?
Oh, lots. I mean, he was his own GM.
Yeah,
So
but did they
think about those
hire
A's,
one?
and you can speak to this very clearly. When they won their World Series in 1974, I mean, we think about baseball front offices, and this was true back then with their VPs of 10 different departments and all their underlings, and the A's were run by 7 people.
Cousin Carl, who I guess you could, he was gone before
Yeah,
started.
he was gone. Charlie, his cousin Carl,
Yeah.
a comptroller.
Yeah, they had a farm director always, and a few scouts, and that was it.
There was a time when they actually didn't have a farm director either, before Finley hired Sid Thrift. He wore all the hats himself. He did everything on his own. And that's why when he had his heart attack, the A's ground to a halt, because Finley did so many things himself. One of the guys I talked to, his underlings, a guy named Jim Bank, was a traveling secretary. Was he the one who got in the fist fight?
No, it was Bob Fulton, the PR guy. Steamboat Fulton.
Jim Bank, everyone loved him. He was a good guy, a good PR director, and he didn't have anything bad to say about Finley. But he quit shortly after he got the job because not only was he the full-time PR director, public relations, he was also made the full-time traveling secretary, responsible for booking all the team's travel accommodations, and then he was made the full-time statistician, which meant that he had to be the first one in the ballpark and the last one out of the ballpark after tabulating the stats every single day. And he's like, he couldn't take it anymore. And he burned out like everyone else burned out. Finley ran through so many employees that they actually constructed a wall of I don't remember what they called it, a wall commemorating the ex-employees. And they just put name after name, like hundreds of names on this wall of guys who just filtered in and out because they couldn't take working for Finley for one reason or another.
The players had a wall like that in the clubhouse. They had notations of all the players. Reggie, had the first stall near the door, and he'd say, all I have to do is sit here and see all my idols walk through, because McCovey came through for a while, and Cepeda, and Rico Cardi,
Billy
and
Williams.
Denny McClain, and then eventually Billy Williams, who actually was productive for a while.
Yeah. It's funny, Ron Bergman, the beat writer, wrote, once an athletic, always an athletic. Or if not once an athletic, then eventually an athletic.
Yeah.
And Finley, as a GM, and this frenetic need for action, I mean, how many trades do you think a typical team makes in the course of a season? 2, 3, maybe?
In the course of a season, yeah, probably 2 or 3.
In 1972, Charlie Finley made 62 trades. The guy could not sit still. But if there was a genius, it was.
And some of them worked. Some of them really, they
Some
were
of them-
necessary.
Yeah, he made some very good trades. He made some bad trades, but the good ones were better than the bad ones. And he left the core players alone. That's the one thing he had going for him. This was all the peripheral players. And the guys at the heart of these championship teams were there for the long haul.
We have a question over here.
Well, he was also very innovative. I mean, he brought color to the game, the uniforms.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I mean, people laughed at the rabbit and everything else, but he was always trying,
Yeah,
He was.
and a lot of them hit and stuck.
absolutely. He shot out ideas left and right, and some of them were very good, and some of them were very bad, and it didn't matter. He was the most prominent champion of the designated hitter. He was the guy pushing weekday World Series games to be played at night, so the working man might be better able to watch.
And started on a Saturday.
Start on a Saturday instead of a Wednesday to maximize weekend play. But then he also had the 3-ball walks, and he pushed for the orange baseball, the alert orange baseball, which again, he got used in spring training tests. And even the guys who crushed the ball, George Hendrick said this was a terrible idea after he hit 3 home runs with the orange ball. I think one of the Angels outfielders said they ought to take the orange ball, wrap it in a blue blanket, and drop it in the Red Sea. So yeah, the guy never stopped innovating.
Do we have another question? Hold on one second.
My impression is when Wally Haas ran the team in 89, 90, 91, they outdrew the Giants. And Wally Haas told me when he bought the team that he went down and he wanted to know about the season ticket holders, and they gave him a piece of paper with handwritten on it 18 season ticket holders. He also told me that he was the first person to ever invite the mayor of Oakland to come to a ball game.
Yeah,
Well, I think Charlie Finley was just such a jerk. Even though the team was fabulous, you could, during the World Series, you could get on the bus and come down to the Coliseum and walk right into the World Series.
yeah. I mean, Finley invited the mayor of San Jose to do ceremonial stuff at the ballpark, but he wouldn't invite the mayor of Oakland, which was odd. And in fact, after the 72 series, Oakland civic leaders were so enamored with the success of the team, they wanted to rename the stadium after Finley. And he essentially gave them middle finger, said, no way. And he cut off their passes as a result. Like, I don't know why it made him angry. That was never clear. Except the only thing I could think of was that it would make things more difficult for him to move the A's later if the field was named after him. But yeah, I mean, you talk about walking into the World Series, and you were there. You probably know what it was like, that there was one ticket window open. And people would walk up traffic, would wait in lines into the middle innings because there was only one ticket booth, and when they got into the stadium, there was one or two concession stands.
Employees, right?
Yeah, he ran a tight ship.
Jason, we have another question over here.
Well, one of the things that Charlie Finley innovated was the East Bay Clown Club. And when he came, as you know, Bill Veck and Charlie Finley, I think, were two of the pioneers in entertainment you've commented on at baseball games. So in 1969, 1970, and I think 1971, why Charlie Finley took our clown group, converted it to, we were a part of a fraternal group that he belonged to, and we couldn't participate as a fraternal group. So he founded the East Bay Clown Club to entertain at the baseball games during those years. So I'm a charter member of Charlie Finley's East Bay Clown Club.
Excellent. I'm glad you made it out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, early on, when the A's first moved here, Finley could not come to an agreement with the musicians union, who had an agreement with the Giants across the bay. He didn't have live music at the ballpark for the first season. They had to play recordings because none of the musicians would play here. He eventually ended up with a Dixieland band called the Swingers, which he took everywhere, including on the team planes to various playoff and World Series locations, driving the players crazy. Live Dixieland music.
With Charlie at the microphone singing crude lyrics.
Yeah.
Sugar in the morning.
Sugar in the Morning. It's a famous one.
All right, we have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
Hi, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to add that Charlie Finley was the first club owner to put females on the field. He had the Oakland A's ball girls on the field.
I would like to point out that the person asking the question is one of said ball girls. Hello, Mary.
Hi,
How
Mary.
you doing, Jason? Nice to see you.
I'm so glad you came out.
Yeah, it was great. Great book. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't know if you guys remember this, but he did dress up two teenagers from Bishop O'Dowd High School in hot pants, and they collected foul balls down the lines.
We picked out the hot pants. He didn't.
Oh,
by the
really?
way. Yeah, we did. Actually, it was Debbie's mother. She made them for us. But anyway.
And Debbie was the other ball girl. The enduring story about Debbie is that, and she was the younger sister of another A's employee. One of Debbie and Mary's duties was to bring hot coffee to the umpires between innings on cold night games. Debbie augmented that with cookies she baked at home from her own recipe. And later, when she grew up, she married a businessman named Arthur Fields and became Mrs. Fields and started her own cookie workshop.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, two more.
When did Charlie Finley sell the A's? And did he sell them to the Haas family?
Yeah, 1980.
1980. And did...
He hired Billy Martin in Billy Martin's first year. Finley was still running the club, but he had intended to sell to the Haas family.
Okay, that was my next question. So Billy did work for Charlie Finley.
1 year.
1 year, and then...
Yeah, they actually had some beef 5, 8 years earlier when Finley claimed that Billy had accepted a job. I think it was just before, just after Alvin Dark. And Billy said, yeah, Finley called me, never sent any of the videotape I asked for, and never returned my calls, so why would I ever work for that guy? And Finley insisted it was Billy who backed out. And it was kind of surprising that Billy came around. When the Haas family took over, they came to examine the offices and were stunned by the wasteland before them. The 3 championship trophies were on a secretary's desk propping up file folders. The bookkeeping of Charlie Finley's A's was so minimal that I found this out. The biggest repository of A's, what's the word for it, office records, is in private hands, because when Finley got to Oakland, he just dumped it all. Dating back to the Philadelphia days, it ended up in a dumpster at the Oakland Coliseum. A janitorial worker found it, put as much as he could into his car, took it home. It sat in his garage for 40 years, and one of his offspring put it on eBay. The A's today have almost nothing from that era, unless they've reacquired it. It's
Sad.
Unfortunate, yeah.
Okay, last question.
You mentioned the word iconoclastic before. I think one of the things that I found attractive about the team was not that it was just a good team, but it was the antithesis of teams like the Orioles and the Reds, the very clean-cut, traditional, long history teams. And the A's played a style of baseball that was not just visually, but physically sort of in the face of that traditional style of baseball. And it was East Coast versus West Coast, and so there was a lot of sort of David and Goliath drama. I guess, can you speak to that, that attractive part about the team?
Yeah, well, I mean, the mustaches came along in '72, the year they won their first World Series. Finley brought along color in baseball. In the early '60s, a couple of years after he bought the team, he changed the color scheme to green and gold. His theory was, once upon a time, all automobiles were black, but manufacturers realized that consumers like colors, and now look, cars come in every color. He did the same for uniforms. He turned the A's green and gold. In 1972, he upped the ante and brought in all but Dayglow green and Dayglow gold, Fort Knox gold and Kelly green and wedding gown white.
White shoes.
White shoes that he insisted were made from albino kangaroos. And that year against the Reds, those Reds were so clean cut that in 1968, they actually removed the old-timey mustache from their mascot, Mr. Red. And Sparky Anderson was, a conservative South Dakotan, and Bob Howsam, the GM, was an ex-Navy guy. And that World Series came to be known as the Hares versus the Squares. And because the Hares won, and because they then went on to win 2 subsequent World Series, I think that it really stuck. And I'm convinced that Charlie Finley, more than anybody, is responsible for dragging baseball from the sport we picture in the 1950s right on into the sport we picture in the 1970s.
All right, I'd like to point out that A Great Good Place for Books is here in the back with Jason's book. It's a great read. He's a great writer. It would make a fabulous Father's Day present. And I want to thank both Glenn Schwartz and Jason Turbow for being here, and let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Glenn, for being here. It was definitely a treat.
Jason will be out in the lobby signing books if you'd like to get a copy and have him sign it. Thank you.
One of my colleagues here, Tanya Shevitz, worked for the Chronicle.
Oh, I know Tanya.
Sitting with
She was coming. She said,
with your wife.
I mean,
I love Tanya.
I know. I see Tanya relatively frequently. She said, I'm not coming for you, I'm coming for Glenn.
And
I gotta take the kids away, but it's great to see you.
Casey, those are awesome questions.